Okay, welcome back. This is a multi-part series on inlay, and I'm going to show you in a few steps how to go from here to there. This is part one. Show you in a few steps, as I said in the intro, how to make this inlay. I played around cutting the inlay by hand, and I'll have a close-up of this in a little bit, and it worked pretty well. However, the problem that I had was where I'm going to be applying this inlay, I had to go across two different substrates, both solid wood and plywood. I didn't have too much of a trouble excavating the space I needed in the solid wood, but it was difficult to get a nice smooth excavation in plywood, a few thousandths of an inch deep that I needed for thin veneer inlay. So what I did was combine techniques from Marquetry as well as a technique that I think all of us are familiar with, and that is to use an inlay kit with your router. And with that technique, I was able to make a leaf inlay with sand shading and make it fit exactly the space I wanted, and also locate it exactly where I wanted it to be. We're going to start off this series by giving you a bird's eye view of my bench. Now normally when I'm working on inlay, my bench is not crowded like this. But what I wanted to do was to show you, starting from the beginning to the end, all the tools and materials that I use. And you'll be able to see that I think most everybody will have these materials on hand, or maybe you have to go to the store and buy a few odds and ends. The nice thing is that this is something you can do in multi-steps over a weekend or several evenings if you want, and you can stop at several spots without causing any problem. So I'm going to readjust the camera, give us a bird's eye view. We'll start at one end of my bench and work down towards the end, and I'll show you the materials that I use to make these inlays. Okay, well let's start at this end of my bench and we'll work our way to the other end. This was my first attempt at inlay. And as I said in the beginning, this inlay attempt was done the traditional manner, in that I used a knife and I cut the outline, and then I used a chisel and gently remove the material to make the recess. And then I hand cut the veneer to fit the inlay and inserted it. What I found is, and this piece right here is veneer on a Baltic birch ply. Excavating that plywood was somewhat difficult with the grain going in different directions and the glue. And I ultimately decided that the best way to do this for this application was to use the traditional router inlay kit. A couple of points on this particular example. The leaf is a green dyed veneer, and when I looked at this, I was just making a practice sample. I wasn't really thinking about grain orientation too much at that point. But you'll notice, and this is an example, you really want the grain to go in a 45-degree radial off the central vein if you can. And you notice here the grain is going this way, kind of perpendicular, and doesn't quite look right. What I did like is the effect of sand shading on that central vein. I think that highlighted it as well as the tip. Another thing you'll notice, this leaf example has a stem. I have another example that doesn't have a stem. I was kind of experimenting to see if I wanted to go through the trouble of doing this part, and ultimately I think it's the right thing to do to put that stem in. It looks more realistic. But this junction right here is kind of important. If that stem does not insert right on the central vein, it doesn't look quite right. And you'll notice in this example it doesn't look quite right. It's slightly off to the right, and that doesn't look good. Now from a global point of view, what I do like is this inlay crosses over this solid wood, which is the rail on a lid of a chest that I'm building, and the panel so I like how that looks, overlapping that piece. It looks more realistic than just sort of out in the center. So those are some of the features I like and dislike about this first example. This example, you can see I've made some changes and I'm getting a little better here. The grain pattern on the leaf insert goes at roughly a 45-degree off that central vein. It looks much nicer. The sand shading, again, I think looks nice. Here's a couple of little things I learned here. This tip is very fragile, and I ended up losing this little piece here. And just for practice purposes, I filled that with wood filler, and of course it doesn't look good to do that, but I wanted to move forward with this example and see how it would turn out. And again, on this one, I did not put the stem. And when I asked my wife which one she liked, with or without the stem, she thought that it looked better with the stem, and ultimately I think it does as well. Now we can see that in this example here. I've got the stem, but again you notice I'm off this time to the left of that central vein, and I worked out a method to get that stem dead center on the vein. And I realized as I'm doing this technique that that vein kind of can move a little bit, and so I cut this after I cut that, but before I glue this insert in. And again, this one I think looks good. It's got the grain going at a 45 off of the central vein. This time I worked out a technique where I can, on a repeated basis, protect that tip. Even though it's fragile, I was able to protect it and repeat that process, so I know it's a pretty workable process. So again, here's what we're doing. We're taking this leaf pattern and we're going from the drawn pattern to the inlay. Now if you look in the back here, you'll see I've got some veneer. Now I've got a box of veneer that I've been collecting, and it's kind of like going to the library and you go through all the different pieces and look at color and grain. So you need to think when you're doing this, am I going to be able to incorporate that, or do I want something bland and neutral, or perhaps something darker? So this piece of veneer, you'll see, has a lot to offer, and you just have to decide what parts of it you're going to use. Now this is another piece that I'm using, and even though it looks kind of light, when it actually is sand shaded and finished, it has a much more golden look, and I think it looks good. This is sort of a representation of a aspen leaf in the fall. So this is the wood that I've ultimately ended up using, and we'll go through how to cut the pattern out. What I've done here is I've used this wood as my wood for picking out my stem. And what I like about this wood is it's got a long grain pattern to it. It has a dark and a light side. And what I found is if I cut the stem out from a piece that is overlapping with the light and the dark, I get a really nice stem. And that's a little hard to appreciate in the camera, but there's a little stippling of light and dark which gives that stem a little bit of roundness to it when you look at it, even though it's totally flat, and I kind of like how it works. So again, I'm using veneer, and these are just a few sample pieces. I've got a whole bunch, but I'm using my veneer to select grain, color, texture to get a pattern that I want. And of course, this leaf is just one thing you can do. You can do all sorts of inlay, and so you use your grain and color and texture as a palette to get the result that you like.